She stared right into her ex's eyes. Desperate for revenge, she grabbed the massive stranger standing next to her and kissed him hard. But she picked the absolute worst man to use as a prop. That brooding man in the shadows was the ruthless Alpha King, and her reckless kiss just accidentally triggered a mating bond with a man whose heart is as cold as ice. This wild, impulsive decision, this panicked mistake, is about to turn into a fiercely possessive love story that leaves her pathetic ex begging in the dirt. However, the way this ending plays out is completely wild. Would they accept the bond, or travel through the ends of the earth to break it? But let's go back to the beginning to see how it all started. Chapter 1. The air at the midsummer fair was thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wood smoke, but all Mina could taste was ash. Under the silver glare of the solstice moon, Cedric was putting on a show. Her ex-mate stood at the edge of the bonfire's glow, his arm wrapped possessively around the waist of his new, exceedingly wealthy betrothed. As if sensing Mina's gaze, Cedric's eyes flicked through the laughing crowd and locked directly onto hers. A cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Maintaining dead-eyed contact with Mina, he deliberately yanked the new girl flush against his chest, tangled his hand in her perfectly coiffed hair, and kissed her with a theatrical, agonizing hunger. He wanted her to watch. He wanted her to break. Hot tears pricked the corners of Mina's eyes, and her inner wolf let out a pathetic, wounded whine. But as the first tear threatened to spill, something hotter and infinitely more reckless ignited in her chest. No, she refused to give him the satisfaction of her quiet heartbreak. She spun on her heel, desperate to look anywhere else, and slammed squarely into a solid wall of muscle. Mina stumbled back, her gaze traveling up a dark, heavy cloak to land on the face of a stranger. He was impossibly tall, casually nursing a cup of mead in one massive hand. His features were sharp, ruthless, and entirely uninterested in the festival around him. He radiated a cold, dangerous stillness. But in that moment of blind hurt, all Mina saw was an opportunity. Acting on pure, frantic adrenaline, Mina lunged forward and grabbed the thick lapels of his cloak. She ignored the warning growl that rumbled deep in his chest, pulled him down to her level, and smashed her lips against his. For a split second, the stranger was rigid as a stone statue. Then, his free hand instinctively came up to grip her waist, his palm large and blistering hot through her thin linen dress. The kiss was breathless, desperate, and entirely public. When Mina finally broke away, gasping for air, the reality of what she had just done crashed down on her like a physical weight. The stranger was looking at her, his striking, predatory hazel eyes slightly widened in sheer shock. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her face burning with sudden, furious humiliation. Before he could utter a single word, she turned and sprinted away from the bonfire, desperate to escape the stares of the village and the colossal mistake she had just made. She ran blindly toward the edge of the woods. 50 paces, 70 paces, 90 paces. At exactly 100 paces, a blinding, supernatural force violently cleaved through her skull. Mina screamed, though no sound left her throat. The migraine was absolute agony, as if a hot iron wedge had been driven directly behind her eyes. Her vision whited out. Her inner wolf let out a terrified shriek. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed backward into the dirt. Except, she didn't hit the ground. She fell hard against a broad, muscular chest. Strong arms clamped around her shoulders, steadying her effortlessly. The exact second she made contact with him, the agonizing pain vanished entirely, leaving behind only the frantic hammering of her own heart and the scent of winter pine and dark magic. "Careful!" A deep, remarkably calm voice rumbled against her ear. Disoriented and panicking, Mina shoved herself out of the stranger's arms and stumbled forward. "Don't touch me! Just leave me alone!" She staggered away, putting distance between them again. 10 paces, 15, 19. At 20 paces, hitting that invisible 100-pace threshold from where he now stood, the invisible iron wedge slammed back into her brain. She gasped, dropping to her knees and clutching her temples. Through her blurred vision, she saw the stranger casually close the distance between them. As soon as he was within the boundary, the pain evaporated like mist in the sun. Mina blinked up at him, panting heavily in the dirt. "What did you do to me?" The stranger looked down at her, his expression utterly unreadable. I stood still and drank my mead. You are the one who assaulted me, completely unprovoked. Determined to prove this was some sort of fluke, Mina stood up and briskly walked backward. The moment she crossed the threshold, the pain violently struck her down again. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees until the relief washed over her. She repeated this ridiculous dance one more time, testing the exact perimeter of the boundary like a confused dog on a very short leash, ultimately ending up panting on the ground at the stranger's boots. "Are you quite finished?" he asked dryly, raising a single dark eyebrow. "Because watching you repeatedly throw yourself into an invisible wall is losing its charm. Looks like the solstice tether, that does," a raspy voice interrupted. Mina looked up to see the old tavern keep smoking a pipe on the back steps of the nearby inn. He gestured with the stem toward the silver moon overhead. Ancient magic in the dirt tonight. A kiss under that moon? You fated yourselves. Can't be separated by more than 100 strides now, or the magic will crack your skulls trying to pull you back together. "That's a myth," Mina snapped, panic rising thick in her throat. "Myth or not," the stranger said, his voice dropping into a commanding baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I have no intention of spending the night standing in the dirt while you test the limits of magical concussions. We are getting a room." 10 minutes later, Mina found herself sitting rigidly on the edge of a lumpy mattress in the village inn. The stranger, who had barely spoken another word, had claimed the single wooden chair in the corner of the small room. He didn't take off his cloak. He didn't even blink. He just sat in the shadows, his piercing eyes tracking her every movement. "You don't have to stare at me," she muttered, pulling her knees to her chest. "I am evaluating my new situation," he replied, his tone smooth and entirely too composed for a man who had just been magically kidnapped by a stranger. "If you were so determined to chain yourself to a man tonight, you could have at least picked one who didn't smell of cheap ale and terrible life choices." Mina flushed, realizing he had seen exactly why she kissed him. "I didn't plan this." "Clearly," he mused, leaning back in the chair. "Get some sleep, little wolf. You are going to need it." Mina took the bed, but sleep was impossible. Every time she opened her eyes, he was still there in the dark, watching her. When the first pale light of morning finally broke through the shutters, the stranger calmly stood up. The relaxed, teasing demeanor from the night before was completely gone, replaced by the chilling, undeniable authority of a ruthless alpha. "Get up!" he ordered in a low, even voice that left absolutely no room for debate. "We are going to see the village elder, and we are going to find out exactly what kind of hell you just unleashed on us both." Chapter 2. Morning light bled through the cracked wooden shutters of the inn, dragging Mina from a fitful, exhausted sleep. For 3 blissful seconds, she forgot. Then, the memories of the previous night, the reckless kiss, the blinding supernatural migraine, the sheer panic, crashed over her like a bucket of freezing water. She bolted upright, clutching the thin quilt to her chest. In the corner of the small room, Kalar hadn't moved an inch. He was still sitting in the rickety wooden chair, his massive frame wrapped in shadows, his piercing hazel eyes tracking her every breath. He hadn't slept. He looked entirely too alert, a coiled predator waiting out the night. "The sun is up, little wolf," he rumbled, his voice rough and completely devoid of warmth. He stood slowly, the worn floorboards groaning under his weight. "Which means it is time to find out exactly how badly you have ruined my life. Get up. We are going to see this village elder." 15 minutes later, the crisp morning air did nothing to cool the burning tension between them as they stood inside a cramped, herb-scented hut. The village elder, a frail woman with eyes like clouded glass, slowly hobbled around them in a circle. Her gnarled fingers hovered in the empty space between Mina and the towering stranger, as if she could feel the heat of a fire they couldn't see. Mina held her breath, her stomach twisting into anxious knots. Beside her, Kalar stood with his arms crossed over his thick chest, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the rustic diagnostics. "The tavern keep was right," the elder finally rasped, dropping her hands. She turned her cloudy gaze to Mina, her expression grim. "You've gone and triggered a solstice tether." The words dropped heavily into the dusty air. "A solstice tether is a children's story," Kalar stated, his deep voice vibrating with absolute alpha authority. "It's a myth, told to keep young pups from mating out of wedlock during the summer festivals. Is that why your head felt like it was split open by a broadsword last night, stranger?" The elder countered sharply. Kalar's jaw ticked. His silence was a reluctant admission of defeat, and it sent a cold spike of pure panic straight through Mina's chest. "What does it mean?" Mina asked, her voice trembling. "How do we undo it?" The elder leaned heavily on her wooden cane. "The old magic of this land doesn't care about your little village dramas, girl. You kissed a fated mate under the solstice moon. The magic recognized the bond and physically anchored it. Right now, it gives you 100 paces. But a tether is a living spell. It feeds on the fated connection." "Meaning?" Kalar prompted, his tone dangerously flat. "Meaning, it's going to get much worse," the elder warned. "As the days pass, the tether will shrink. The bond will demand that you be closer, and closer, until you are entirely inseparable. The migraine penalty for defying it will go from agonizing to lethal. Your minds will literally break under the strain of separation unless you fully consummate and accept the mating bond." Mina choked on her own spit. "Consummate? I don't even know him. He's a complete stranger. There has to be a way to break it." "There used to be beings who could sever such ancient magic," the elder sighed, shaking her head. "But they were hunted, faded into the earth. There is only one left that I know of, the last oracle." Kalar's posture immediately stiffened. "No, absolutely not." "Where?" Mina demanded, ignoring his sudden hostility. "Deep within the Fae Woods," the elder said. Mina felt the blood drain from her face. The Fae Woods were legendary for being treacherous, untamed, and entirely lethal to regular wolves. People who went in did not come out. "Well," Kalar drawled, entirely too calm as he turned toward the door, "it seems we are going for a walk. Try not to get us killed before lunch." An hour later, the reality of the situation had set in, sending Mina into a frantic packing frenzy inside her small cottage. She shoved woolen socks, a hunting knife, and a bag of dried venison into a weathered leather satchel, her hands shaking with the sheer absurdity of her life. Kalar leaned against her bedroom doorframe, dwarfing the entrance. He wasn't packing. He simply watched her tear apart her room with the detached, analytical gaze of a wolf studying a particularly chaotic squirrel. "Do you really need 3 hairbrushes?" he asked dryly. Mina paused, staring at the wooden brush in her hand. "The woods are damp. My hair frizzes." "Frightening," he deadpanned. "I'm sure the flesh-eating pixies will be terrified of your split ends." Mina shot him a withering glare and threw the brush into her bag. "You aren't exactly helping. This is a disaster. My entire life is a disaster." "Agreed." He casually crossed his thick arms, the dark leather of his bracers creaking. "Though I am still trying to understand your tactical approach to said disaster. If you were so determined to chain yourself to a man, to spite your ex, couldn't you have aimed slightly higher?" Mina stiffened. "Excuse me?" "The boy," Kalar clarified, a wicked, ruthless smirk playing on his lips. "The one putting on the theatrical display of affection by the bonfire. That was the target of your little stunt, wasn't it?" Mina's face flamed hotly. "His name is Cedric, and he was the son of the head merchant." "I don't care if he was the son of the sun god," Kalar scoffed, his deep voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. "I stood near him for 5 minutes. He smelled of cheap ale, extreme insecurity, and terrible life choices. The man had the posture of a boiled cabbage. You kissed me just to make that jealous?" "He broke my heart," Mina defended, though her voice lacked its usual fire. Hearing Kalar ruthlessly dismantle Cedric's entire existence in 2 sentences was entirely shocking and annoyingly validating. Kalar pushed off the doorframe, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. The sheer size of him seemed to swallow the room's remaining oxygen. "You grabbed the deadliest, largest alpha in the perimeter, hauled him down by his cloak, and kissed him breathless in front of half the village. Over a cabbage?" He was teasing her. The big, terrifying, brooding stranger was actively roasting her dating history. Mina couldn't stop the involuntary, breathy laugh that escaped her lips. "When you put it like that, it sounds unhinged." "It was highly unhinged," Kalar agreed, his hazel eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Grab your frizz-taming equipment, little wolf. We're leaving. The tension had noticeably thawed by the time they walked through the bustling village square. Mina kept her head down, desperate to avoid the gossiping stares of her neighbors. Kalar, however, walked with a slow, predatory arrogance that caused the morning crowds to part for him instinctively. They reached the wooden boundary markers at the edge of the village, where the dirt road gave way to the dense, foreboding tree line of the outer woods. I need to adjust my boots, Kalar said, stopping beside the marker. Keep walking. Let's see if the boundary is still 100 paces. Mina nodded, her nerves fraying as she continued down the path. She counted her steps carefully in her head. 50 paces, 60 paces, 70. At exactly 85 paces, a blinding, white-hot spike of agony drove itself directly behind Mina's eyes. She screamed, dropping her satchel as her knees buckled. It was sharper and far more violent than the night before. Farther back up the path, a low, vicious snarl ripped through the air. Kalar had been hit with it too. Mina scrambled backward in the dirt, gasping for air as Kalar sprinted forward, his face tight with pain. As soon as he crossed the invisible 80-pace threshold, the migraine vanished, leaving them both panting and staring at each other in horror. The elder was right. The tether was already shrinking, and it was demanding they stay closer than before. Chapter 3. By mid-afternoon, the oppressive humidity of the Fae Woods had turned Mina into a walking, miserable disaster. Twigs were stuck in her tangled hair, her boots were caked in thick, gray mud, and she smelled distinctly of nervous sweat and old pine needles. Kalar, infuriatingly, did not possess a single drop of sweat on his brow. He navigated the dense, thorny underbrush with the effortless, silent grace of a shadow, his dark clothes immaculate. He didn't even look like he was breathing hard. "Do you just not perspire?" Mina panted, swatting a massive, iridescent bug away from her face. "Is that an alpha thing? Or are you just magically repulsive to dirt?" Kalar paused, glancing back at her over his broad shoulder. His gaze slowly dragged over her disheveled state, the corner of his mouth twitching in a deeply insulting way. "I simply know how to walk without aggressively fighting the flora, little wolf. You, on the other hand, look like you've been dragged backward through a swamp." "I hate you," she grumbled, stepping over a rotting log. "You bound us together," he reminded her, effortlessly. Before Mina could fire back a retort, the glorious, musical sound of rushing water echoed through the trees. She pushed past a thick wall of ferns and nearly wept with relief. A wide, fast-moving stream cut through the forest floor, the water crystal clear and tumbling aggressively over smooth gray stones. Mina dropped her satchel onto the dirt with a heavy thud. "I am bathing. If I have to spend one more minute marinating in my own misery, I am going to voluntarily feed myself to the local predators." Kalar leaned against a towering oak tree, crossing his thick arms. "I admire your commitment to hygiene, but need I remind you of our current magical predicament? At 81 paces, our skulls feel like they are being crushed by anvils." "Then you will stand exactly 79 paces away," Mina declared, marching toward the water's edge and beginning to unlace her boots. "I am a wolf, Mina," he deadpanned. "I have enhanced sight. At 79 paces, I will still see absolutely everything." Mina froze, her face flushing crimson. She snatched her boots off and pointed a menacing finger at him. "Then you will wear a blindfold." 10 minutes later, the negotiation was complete, resulting in the most ridiculous visual Mina had ever witnessed. Exactly 79 paces away from the riverbank, the deadliest, most ruthless alpha she had ever met was standing rigidly in the middle of a dirt path. His heavy dark cloak was securely tied around his head, completely covering his eyes like a makeshift oversized bandage. "No peeking," Mina yelled over the roar of the rapids, wading into the freezing, waist-deep water with a bar of lye soap. "I am an alpha king, not a voyeur." Kalar's deep, rumbling voice boomed effortlessly through the trees. Even blindfolded and shouting, he sounded devastatingly arrogant. "And hurry up! This cloak smells like horsehair." "Suffer!" Mina shouted back, ducking under the frigid water. She resurfaced with a gasp, furiously scrubbing at her scalp. The cold was shocking, but washing the grime of the journey away felt heavenly. "I am still trying to figure out the cabbage." Kalar hollered a moment later, his voice cutting through the sounds of the forest. Mina wiped soapy water from her eyes. "What? Cedric!" Kalar yelled, leaning casually against a tree despite being utterly blind. "I have been evaluating your personality all morning. You are stubborn, loud, and you have remarkably sharp elbows. How did a woman with such pointy elbows end up dating a coward?" "My elbows are not pointy," Mina shrieked, thoroughly offended. She aggressively lathered the soap. "And he was very sweet in the beginning. He was weak." Kalar roasted him across the 79-pace divide. "I saw him flinch when a pigeon flew too close to his head at the festival." "A pigeon, Mina?" "It was a very large bird," Mina yelled back, though a snort of laughter escaped her. "You would have murdered him in his sleep out of pure boredom within a year," Kalar shouted cheerfully. "Honestly, bonding yourself to a terrifying stranger was probably the best career move you could have made." "You are infuriating," Mina yelled, stepping backward to rinse the soap from her hair. "And you are severely overestimating your own charm." Her heel came down hard on a submerged, moss-covered stone. In a fraction of a second, Mina's footing completely vanished. Her arms flailed wildly, hitting nothing but air, before she pitched backward. The fast-moving current immediately grabbed her, yanking her under the frigid, churning water with terrifying force. She swallowed a mouthful of the stream, tumbling head over heels as the rapids swept her violently downstream. 79 paces away, Kalar was opening his mouth to deliver another witty insult when an agonizing, blinding strike of pain violently cleaved through his brain. It was instant, searing, absolute torture. The current had already dragged Mina past the 80-pace threshold, and the magical tether was violently punishing them for the separation. A monstrous, earth-shaking roar ripped from Kalar's throat, ignoring the skull-crushing agony that threatened to drop him to his knees. He didn't even waste a millisecond trying to untie the knot on his makeshift blindfold. Operating on pure, feral instinct and the scent of her distress, the ruthless alpha blindly charged through the dense underbrush, crashing past the tree line and launching his massive body directly into the raging rapids. Chapter 4. The river spit them out onto a rocky bank far downstream. Mina collapsed into the wet reeds, coughing violently, her lungs burning from the frigid water. A second later, a massive, soaking wet form hauled himself out of the shallows beside her. Kalar tore the soaked cloak from his face, gasping for air. The exact moment he collapsed into the mud next to her, their shoulders brushing, the agonizing spike in their heads dissolved. Relief washed over Mina so powerfully, she let out a jagged sob, burying her face in her hands. "Don't," Kalar murmured, his chest heaving as he rolled over and pulled her against his side. "Just breathe, little wolf. You are safe." By the time the sun dipped below the jagged tree line, the damp air of the Fae Woods had turned bitterly cold. Kalar managed to coax a small, crackling fire to life under the hollow arch of a massive tree root, his survival instincts proving far more useful than his usual arrogant banter. Mina sat practically on top of the flames, but her teeth were still chattering so violently she could barely speak. Wordlessly, Kalar shifted closer and pulled her between his legs, wrapping his heavy, surprisingly warm cloak around both of their shivering shoulders. The sheer heat radiating from his muscular frame was intoxicating, as his arms came around her waist, pulling her back flush against his broad chest. The last lingering echo of the migraine vanished completely. The magical tether purred in their minds, deeply satisfied by the intense physical closeness. The forest around them settled into an eerie quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the steady, rhythmic thud of Kalar's heartbeat against Mina's back. The frantic panic and the sharp bickering of the day had been completely washed away by the river, leaving behind a raw, fragile intimacy in the firelight. "I didn't care about the wealth, or his father's merchant status," Mina whispered into the dark, her voice trembling with something much heavier than the cold. Kalar didn't push her to explain. His arms simply tightened fractionally around her waist, a silent, grounding anchor in the dark. "I know, Cedric. He didn't just leave me for someone else," she continued, her throat incredibly tight. "He made sure everyone knew I wasn't enough for him. He paraded her around because he wanted me to feel small, invisible. He wanted me to feel like everything we shared for the last 2 years was entirely worthless." A rogue tear slipped down her pale cheek, and she hated herself for it. And for a terrifying moment by that bonfire, I actually believed him. I felt completely worthless. Kalar shifted, gently but firmly, turning her within the heavy cocoon of his cloak, so she was forced to look up into his face. The teasing, arrogant spark in his hazel eyes was completely gone, replaced by a dark, intense sincerity that stole the breath straight from her lungs. He reached up, his large, calloused thumb gently brushing the damp tear away from her cheek. His touch was shockingly tender for a man built for war. "Cedric is a blind, insecure fool," Kalar murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated deep in her bones. "He wanted you to feel small because he was terrified of your fire. You are the furthest thing from invisible, Mina. You survived this forest. You argued with an alpha king, and you are fearless. You are vibrant. You are witty. You are fiercely, entirely alive." Mina stared up at him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs for an entirely different reason now. The small space between them felt suddenly charged, heavy with a thick, unspoken magnetism. Kalar's gaze dropped slowly to her lips, and the air around them seemed to pull tight like a drawn bowstring. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. The heat of his breath dusted her shivering skin. Mina tilted her chin up, her eyelids fluttering shut, completely surrendering to the inevitable, gravitational pull between them. But right before their lips could brush, the crackling campfire beside them vanished. It didn't just blow out, it was completely, violently snuffed out in a fraction of a second. An unnatural, thick white mist poured silently over the tree roots, rolling toward them like a creeping tide, instantly dropping the temperature to a bone-chilling, icy freeze. Chapter 5. The frost hit them first, sinking straight through flesh and bone. Kalar tightened his grip on Mina, but the thick, unnatural mist slithered between them like living smoke, forcibly prying them apart. The air grew so dense it was like breathing underwater. "Kalar?" Mina gasped, reaching out into the sudden, suffocating whiteout. Her fingers brushed only freezing air. The heavy warmth of his body was completely gone. "Kalar, where are you? Stay exactly where you are!" his voice shouted, though the mist distorted the sound, making it echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do not move, Mina." She tried to hold her ground, but the mist began to swirl, carrying voices that had absolutely no business being in the Fae Woods. "She actually thought she was enough," a voice sneered, perfectly mimicking Cedric's cruel, arrogant drawl. Mina flinched, clamping her hands over her ears. "No, stop." The fog shifted, hardening into translucent, ghostly figures. The entire village square materialized around her. There was Cedric, arm in arm with his beautiful, wealthy bride, throwing his head back in laughter. The villagers pointed at Mina, their faces twisted in pity and disgust. "Look at her," the illusion of the village elder whispered from the swirling vapor. "So desperate, so utterly invisible. No wonder she had to trap a stranger with magic just to get him to look at her." "Kalar pities you," Cedric's phantom mocked, stepping closer, his face looming out of the whiteout. "He's an alpha king. Do you really think he wants a pathetic, plain little village girl clinging to his back? You're just a magical burden. He's waiting for the moment he can finally be rid of you." The insecurities she had just confessed by the fire were weaponized, slicing into her fragile heart like daggers. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her throat. She couldn't breathe. She had to get away from the voices. She had to escape the suffocating laughter. Ignoring Kalar's warning, Mina turned and ran blindly into the fog. She sprinted through the freezing mist, tearing through thorny brambles that ripped at her dress, desperate to outrun the phantom echoes of her ex. She had no sense of direction, no concept of distance. 50 paces, 60 paces. The laughter grew louder, chasing her through the dead woods. She scrambled over a jagged pile of rocks, her lungs burning, tears streaming down her face. 80 paces. The magical tether pulled taut, and then, the invisible guillotine dropped. It wasn't a migraine this time, it was a violent, apocalyptic rupture. Mina shrieked as a blinding white agony cleaved her skull in two. Her vision went completely black, her body going rigid as she was thrown forcefully to the cold earth. She hit the ground hard, her nails digging into the dirt as her mind was shredded by the agonizing penalty of the shrinking bond. On the other side of the mist, Kalar was violently driven to his knees. A monstrous, blood-curdling roar tore from the Alpha King's throat as the tether aggressively punished him for the separation. The pain was absolute, a searing hot iron spiking directly through his brain, blinding him, paralyzing him. The mist swirled around him, whispering his own dark fears. That he was too violent, too ruinous, that he couldn't protect the one thing his wolf had finally chosen. He didn't care about the whispers. He only cared about the sudden, terrifying silence on the other end of their bond. Kalar slammed his massive fists into the freezing dirt, his knuckles bleeding as he fought against the magical paralysis. His fangs lengthened, his golden eyes flaring violently in the mist. The tether was threatening to snap their minds entirely, demanding they accept the death of the distance. "Mina!" he roared, a feral, terrifying sound that shook the very roots of the ancient trees, pushing through the skull-crushing agony through sheer, unadulterated alpha willpower. Kalar forced himself back onto his feet. The world was spinning in a nauseating blur of pain, but he flared his nostrils, desperately hunting for her scent beneath the smell of frost and rotting magic. Their nervous sweat, lye soap, and the faint, sweet scent of wildflowers. He staggered forward, moving like a wounded beast, every single step acting as a fresh sledgehammer to his skull. The mist tried to confuse him, shifting the terrain, throwing phantoms into his path, but the ruthless king bulldozed through them, driven by a primal, desperate need to reach his mate before the magic broke her completely. Mina lay curled in a tight ball on the damp earth, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her consciousness was slipping away into a dark, painless void. The pressure in her head was entirely lethal. This was it. The magic was going to kill her. Suddenly, heavy boots hit the ground beside her. A massive shadow blotted out the pale mist, and strong, desperate hands grabbed her shoulders. Kalar collapsed to his knees, violently dragging her limp body off the dirt and crushing her directly into his broad chest. The moment their bodies collided, the apocalyptic pain vanished. It didn't fade. It was instantly obliterated. A profound, shuddering wave of relief crashed over them both. Mina gasped, dragging massive lungfuls of air into her burning chest, her hands immediately tangling in the thick fabric of his soaked tunic. She buried her face into his neck, sobbing uncontrollably as the fated bond purred aggressively in the back of her mind. Immensely satisfied by their proximity, Kalar was breathing just as hard, his heavy chest heaving against hers. He wrapped his arms around her so tightly it bruised, burying his face in her damp hair. He didn't say a word about her running. He simply held her there in the dirt, rocking her slightly, his massive frame trembling from the adrenaline and the violent aftermath of the pain. "I'm sorry," she choked out against his collarbone, her voice wrecked. "The voices, I couldn't, it wasn't real." Kalar breathed harshly, his hand coming up to firmly cradle the back of her head, anchoring her to him. "None of it was real. You are safe. I have you." They stayed like that for several long minutes, clinging to each other in the dirt as their heartbeats slowly synchronized. The thick, oppressive mist that had tortured them finally began to thin, swirling away into nothingness now that its cruel game had failed. As the fog cleared, the moonlight spilled over the clearing, illuminating the true danger they had blindly stumbled into. Mina pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes as Kalar's grip on her suddenly went terrifyingly rigid. He slowly pushed her behind him, his golden eyes locked on the perimeter. They were no longer in the forest. Mina's blind sprint had led them directly into the center of a massive circular courtyard made of crumbling, ancient white stone. Colossal pillars lay shattered across the floor, covered in glowing bioluminescent moss. But that wasn't what made Kalar bare his teeth. Surrounding the perimeter of the courtyard were towering, 20-foot-tall stone statues of ancient Fae warriors, gripping massive granite broadswords. As the last of the mist cleared, a deep, grinding sound of stone on stone echoed through the ruins. Mina watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as the ancient stone guardians slowly began to turn their massive, featureless heads toward them, one by one. Deep within their carved stone faces, glowing, brilliant blue eyes began to snap open, illuminating the ruins in a cold, deadly light. Chapter 6. The glowing blue eyes of the ancient statues locked onto them, and a fraction of a second later, the solid earth beneath their feet simply ceased to exist. The deafening crack of shattering bedrock echoed through the ruins as the massive white stone courtyard violently gave way, collapsing into a sprawling, bottomless black abyss. Kalar's arm shot out, locking around Mina's waist like a steel vice, yanking her flush against his chest, just as the floor beneath them crumbled into the void. They were left standing on a single, fractured stone tile, no larger than a dining table, suspended miraculously over a yawning expanse of absolute nothingness. A cold, howling wind rushed up from the dark, whipping Mina's hair across her face. Ahead of them, a perilous, shifting path of floating stone fragments stretched across the chasm toward the safety of the far archway. The tiles were drifting, violently grinding against one another, their edges crumbling into dust that plummeted into the dark. "We have to jump," Kalar gritted out, his glowing golden eyes instantly calculating the trajectory of the drifting labyrinth. Mina stared down into the terrifying, pitch-black drop, her stomach fully inverting. Her knees shook so violently she nearly collapsed against him. "I can't, Kalar! I can't do this!" "I'm going to fall." He turned her aggressively by the shoulders, forcing her to look away from the abyss and directly into his face. His grip was bruising, pulling her out of her spiraling panic. "Listen to me." His deep voice sliced through the roaring wind, commanding and absolute. "If we jump out of sync, the distance will trigger the migraine while we are in midair. The pain will blind us, we will miss the landing, and we will fall. You are not dying down there, and more importantly, you are absolutely not dragging me down there. I am a very heavy alpha. If you drop me, we both become dungeon paste, and I refuse to end my royal lineage as a smudge in the dirt. So you had better watch your step." A slightly hysterical, breathy laugh tore from her throat. He was weaponizing his arrogance, giving her something sharp and solid to hold on to in the midst of the chaos. "Okay," she breathed, nodding frantically. "Tell me what to do." "We move as one," he ordered softly, never breaking eye contact. "Do not look at the drop. Look at me. Only at me." The first floating tile drifted dangerously close, grinding against the wind. "On 3, Kayla rumbled, his chest pressed firmly to hers. 1, 2, 3, they leaped simultaneously. They landed on the adjacent tile, their boots hitting the stone in perfect unison. Immediately, the stone they had just abandoned shattered into pieces and dropped into the void. "Again," Kalar commanded. They jumped again, and again. The labyrinth was a waking nightmare of timing and precision. The tiles shifted unpredictably in the howling updraft, forcing them to leap wider and faster. Mina kept her eyes locked entirely on Kalar's face, matching the frantic rhythm of her breathing to the rise and fall of his broad chest. The invisible magical tether between them remained completely slack. They were moving flawlessly, an intricate, desperate dance over a bottomless grave. They were 10 leaps away from the far archway when the wind violently surged. "Jump!" Kalar yelled. Mina pushed off, but the tile beneath her boots unexpectedly disintegrated a fraction of a second too early. Her wet boot slipped on the crumbling edge. She didn't get enough distance. She hit the edge of the next floating tile hard, the breath blasting from her lungs as her torso slammed onto the stone. Her legs dangled uselessly over the black abyss. The sudden displacement snapped the magical tether entirely taut. A searing, blinding spike of agony violently cleaved through both of their skulls. Kalar stumbled as he landed, dropping heavily to one knee as the migraine temporarily blinded him. Mina screamed, her fingers slipping frantically on the smooth, freezing stone as gravity began to violently drag her backward into the void. She was sliding off. The tether was pulling Kalar toward the edge with her. "Mina!" Kalar roared, fighting blindly through the skull-crushing pain. Just as her fingers lost their final grip on the ledge, a massive, calloused hand shot out and clamped around her wrist like an iron trap. Mina dangled over the howling darkness, her arm socket burning, suspended by absolutely nothing but Kalar's grip. The alpha was lying flat on his stomach on the crumbling tile, his massive shoulder muscles bulging, his teeth bared in a feral, bloody snarl as he fought the migraine and her dead weight. "Look at me," he grunted, the veins in his neck standing out thick and dark. Mina threw her head back, terrified tears streaming down her face, and met his eyes, through the agonizing haze of the tether's punishment. His gaze was a burning, furious promise. He was not letting go. With a guttural roar of pure, earth-shattering alpha strength, Kalar hauled her straight up and over the ledge, throwing her safely onto the center of the stone tile. He immediately collapsed over her, shielding her with his massive body as they gasped for air. The pain instantly dissolved as their chests collided. "I have you," he breathed raggedly, his forehead resting heavily against hers. "I have you." The final floating tiles began to align rapidly, forming a straight, narrow bridge to the exit. Moving with a desperate, unspoken synergy, they scrambled to their feet, communicating entirely through the deep, locked gaze between them. They broke into a dead sprint. They leaped from crumbling stone to crumbling stone in absolute unison, the abyss snapping at their heels, jumping for the safety of the solid archway just as the final tile vanished into the dark. They crashed hard into the solid dirt on the other side, rolling frantically away from the ledge. Behind them, the abyss simply vanished, replaced by the solid ruins of the courtyard. Sayalost, the trial was over. Mina lay on her back, panting toward the dark canopy of the Fae Woods, completely high on adrenaline and the sheer impossibility of their survival. Kalar let out a low, rough laugh, pushing himself up to sit beside her. "You are remarkably terrifying in a crisis, little wolf," he murmured, wiping a streak of dirt from his jaw. He stood up, rolling his sore shoulders, and took a few steps toward the perimeter to scout the path ahead. Mina watched him walk. 1 pace, 4 paces, 7 paces. At exactly 10 paces, the invisible guillotine dropped. Mina violently shrieked, instantly curling into a fetal position as the worst migraine she had ever experienced in her life drove a white-hot spike into her brain. Kalar was thrown entirely to the dirt with a brutal groan, clutching his temples as the agony shredded his senses. He blindly scrambled backward on his hands and knees, dragging himself across the dirt until he crossed the 10-pace threshold. The pain evaporated, leaving them both shaking, panting, and terrified in the dirt. Mina stared at him, her heart dropping completely into her stomach. The trial hadn't just tested their bond, it had permanently altered it. The 100 paces were gone. They were now magically chained to a 10-pace radius, and the tether was demanding a physical closeness they could no longer escape. Chapter 7. 10 paces was not a tether, it was a noose. Over the next 7 torturous days, the Fae Woods threw every lethal nightmare it had at them, venomous briars, shadow stalkers, and sinking mud, but the magic of the shrinking bond was proving to be the most dangerous predator of all. 10 paces meant they couldn't even forage for firewood separately. It meant they breathed the same air, walked in each other's footprints, and could never truly look away. Most dangerously, it meant they could no longer sleep on opposite sides of the fire. Every accidental brush of their hands sent actual, crackling sparks racing up Mina's arm. The emotional tension had skyrocketed, growing so incredibly thick it was practically suffocating. The banter, once a weapon used to annoy each other, had evolved into a desperate, fragile shield to keep them from crossing a line they couldn't uncross. On the 7th night, they huddled under the massive roots of a fallen weeping willow to escape a freezing drizzle. Kalar was sitting entirely too close, his massive thigh pressed flush against hers to share body heat as he expertly sharpened his hunting knife. "You know," Kalar murmured, his deep voice sliding through the dark like velvet. "I have been thinking about the cabbage again." Mina let out a soft, exhausted laugh, resting her head against the rough bark. "Cedric is not a cabbage, Kalar." "Highly debatable," Kalar countered smoothly, catching her gaze in the firelight. The teasing spark in his golden eyes was laced with something much heavier, much darker. "But I have finally concluded my assessment. A sheltered village girl who can outsmart ancient Fae guardians, leap across bottomless voids, and somehow survive my notoriously terrible disposition is vastly overqualified for a merchant's son. You would have shattered his fragile ego in a week." Mina looked up at his sharp, breathtaking profile, the firelight casting deep shadows over his scarred eyebrow. The truth hit her with a sudden, overwhelming gravity that stole the breath from her lungs. She was sitting in the middle of the deadliest, most unpredictable forest in the realm, surrounded by lethal magic. And yet, she felt infinitely safer pressed against this ruthless alpha king than she ever had in the quiet safety of her own village. The bond was no longer just a magical obligation forcing them together. It was a deep, undeniable connection, sinking its claws directly into her heart. She didn't want the distance back. In the next evening, the oppressive gloom of the forest suddenly broke, revealing a breathtaking, secluded grove. The dense canopy above was completely choked with glowing, bioluminescent blue blossoms, casting an ethereal, glowing light over the soft, mossy floor. The air was thick, heavy with a sweet, intoxicating scent that made Mina's pulse race. They stopped in the center of the glowing glade. The silence between them was deafening, the air pulling tight like a drawn bowstring. Kalar looked down at her, the protective shield of his teasing completely draining from his features. What was left behind was a raw, starving intensity that made Mina's knees go weak. Slowly, deliberately, he let his hunting knife slip back into its sheath. He reached out, his large, rough fingers gently grazing her jawline. The touch sent a violent, electric shiver straight down her spine. His thumb softly brushed her cheekbone before he tenderly tucked a stray, wind-blown curl behind her ear. His touch was painfully gentle for a man built for war. His golden gaze dropped to her lips, and the fated bond in their minds let out a deep, demanding purr. This time, there was no mist. There were no ghosts of her past to chase her away. Mina tilted her chin up, her eyelids fluttering shut in complete, terrified surrender. Kalar leaned in, the heavy heat of his breath washing over her trembling skin, closing the final inch between them. But just as his lips softly brushed against hers, a deafening subterranean crack echoed through the grove, and the solid ground beneath their feet began to aggressively, violently vibrate. Chapter 8. The violent vibration shattered the intimate moment, throwing Mina off balance. Kalar instantly anchored her against his chest, dropping into a defensive crouch as the mossy floor of the glade began to split apart. The bioluminescent blossoms above flickered wildly. From the rupturing earth, massive, ancient roots twisted and coiled upward, weaving together to form a towering, throne-like structure. Sitting at its center was a being entirely woven from silver wood and starlight. The last oracle, she had no eyes, only smooth, glowing bark, where a face should be, but Mena felt the ancient creature's piercing gaze strip her down to her soul. "The tether has pulled taut," the oracle's voice echoed, sounding like rustling leaves and distant thunder. "It has tasted your hearts. It is nearly absolute." Kalar didn't draw a weapon, but his grip on Mina tightened protectively. "We were told you could sever it. We need the bond broken." His voice lacked its usual commanding bite. It sounded strained, almost hollow. The oracle slowly extended a branch-like hand. The bark peeled back to reveal a single, intricately carved silver vial, glowing with a cold, pale light. "This is the elixir of severance," the ethereal being whispered, the vial floating gently into Kalar's waiting palm. "It is the only magic left in this realm, strong enough to cut the threads of the solstice moon. But magic of this magnitude requires absolute, mutual surrender. You must both willingly share the draught at the exact moment the first light of dawn pierces the canopy." The oracle leaned back into the twisting roots, her form beginning to dissolve back into the earth. "Choose carefully, wolves. If the sun rises fully and the vial remains full, the magic will permanently solidify. The bond will be unbreakable for the rest of your mortal lives." The silence that fell over the glade was deafening. The ground sealed itself, leaving them completely alone, with a tiny silver vial that held the power to rip them apart forever. They didn't build a fire. They didn't need one. They sat on the soft, glowing moss under the canopy, the 10-pace radius feeling like a vast, agonizing chasm, despite them sitting shoulder to shoulder. The silver vial rested on a flat stone between them, taunting them with its pale, icy glow. The banter was entirely gone. There were no jokes to hide behind, no dangerous obstacles to distract them. There was only the crushing, suffocating weight of tomorrow. "I have spent my entire life ruling a violent kingdom," Kalar murmured into the quiet dark, his voice a low, rough rasp that broke the silence. He leaned his head back against the trunk of a massive tree, staring up at the glowing blossoms. His emotional walls, the impenetrable armor of the ruthless Alpha King, had completely crumbled. "I was raised to be a weapon. I was taught that attachment is a liability, that a king must stand entirely alone to be strong." Mina turned to look at him, her heart aching at the raw, unguarded vulnerability in his sharp, beautiful features. He slowly turned his head to meet her gaze, his golden eyes shining with a desperate, heavy sorrow that made her breath hitch. "I don't know how to go back, Mina. I don't know how to wake up tomorrow and not feel the warmth of your presence in the back of my mind. I don't know how to breathe without knowing exactly where you are." He reached out, his large hand gently engulfing hers, his rough thumb tracing the delicate pulse at her wrist. "You asked me to stand 79 paces away at the river, and it nearly tore my chest open. Tomorrow, you will walk 100 miles away, back to your quiet village, back to a life that makes sense, and I will have to let you." A single tear slipped down Mina's cheek, dripping onto their joined hands. She wanted to scream at him, to beg him to tell her not to drink it, but the choice was entirely hers. He was giving her the freedom she had originally begged for on day one, even if it destroyed him. "Go to sleep, little wolf," he whispered, pressing a lingering, heartbreaking kiss to her knuckles. "I will keep watch." Mina eventually succumbed to an exhausted, fitful sleep, her head resting heavily on Kalar's broad shoulder, breathing in the scent of winter pine one last time. When she finally opened her eyes, the dark sky was bleeding into a pale, dusty violet. The birds had begun to sing. Dawn was breaking. She sat up, a cold panic gripping her chest as she realized the moment had arrived. Kalar was already awake. He was sitting quietly beside her, bathed in the very first, fragile rays of morning light that were piercing through the dense canopy above. His face was a mask of tragic, beautiful stoicism. He held his hand out toward her. Resting in his palm was the silver vial. The cork had already been removed, the first light was here, and the ruthless Alpha King was offering her the final choice. Chapter 9. The pale, dusty violet light of dawn crept slowly across the glowing moss, illuminating the silver vial in Kalar's outstretched hand. The uncorked liquid inside shimmered, cold and final. Mina stared at it, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the freedom she had cried for on the first day. The end of the pain, the end of the magic, the end of them. "I will drink it," Kalar whispered, his voice dangerously rough, cracking under the immense weight of his restraint. "If you truly want your quiet life back, Mina, I will swallow this poison, and I will walk away, but I will not lie to you. My wolf will mourn your absence until the day I die. You have ruined me for anyone else." The raw, bleeding honesty in his words shattered whatever fragile walls Mina had left. She looked up from the silver vial to his face. The deadly, unyielding Alpha King looked completely at her mercy, waiting for her to deliver the final blow. She thought about her quiet village. She thought about the safety of her little cottage, the predictable routine of her life, before she kissed a stranger at a bonfire. It all felt entirely suffocating now. She didn't want safety. She wanted the terrifying, beautiful fire she had found in the Fae Woods. She wanted him, without breaking eye contact. Mina reached out, her trembling fingers brushed against his as she took the cold silver vial from his massive palm. Kalar's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek as he braced himself for the agonizing snap of the bond. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. Mina didn't drink. With absolute, unwavering certainty, she tilted her wrist and deliberately poured the shimmering elixir directly onto the mossy earth. The liquid hissed as it hit the dirt, evaporating into a harmless wisp of silver smoke before completely vanishing. Kalar's eyes snapped open, his pupils blown entirely wide. He stared at the empty vial rolling from her hand, his chest heaving as if he couldn't quite process what she had just done. "I don't want my quiet life back," Mina breathed, a tear spilling over her lashes as a radiant smile broke across her face. "I want the ruin." A ragged, shaky breath tore from Kalar's throat. The heavy, suffocating restraint he had carried for days instantly snapped. He lunged forward, entirely closing the space between them, his massive hands gripping either side of her face as he pulled her into a desperately passionate kiss. It was a collision of pure, unadulterated relief. Mina tangled her hands in his dark hair, kissing him back with every ounce of the fierce love she had been terrified to admit. The exact moment their lips met, the invisible magical tether that had tortured them for days, simply dissolved. The threat of the migraines, the agonizing restrictions of the distance, vanished into thin air. In its place, A brilliant, golden warmth bloomed in the center of Mina's chest. She could feel him, his profound relief, his fierce protectiveness, his overwhelming love, resonating perfectly within her own mind. The fated bond was permanently sealed. The journey back to the edge of the Fae Woods took 3 days, but it felt entirely different. The oppressive, terrifying atmosphere of the forest seemed to part for them. They no longer had to count their paces. They could have walked 100 miles apart without a single spike of pain. But they didn't. They walked shoulder to shoulder, Kalar's large hand completely swallowing hers, their fingers tightly intertwined by absolute choice. The banter returned, but it was no longer a shield. It was a playful, intimate game between equals. Kalar still teased her about her frizzing hair, and Mina mercilessly roasted his brooding alpha scowls, but every insult ended with a lingering touch or a shared, knowing smile. By the time they finally breached the tree line and saw the familiar wooden boundary markers of Mina's village, she felt entirely invincible. She was walking hand in hand with a king, and she belonged exactly where she was. The morning market was in full swing as they stepped out of the woods and onto the cobblestone streets. Villagers paused, their eyes going wide at the sight of the heavily armed, towering stranger and the local girl whose disappearance had fueled days of vicious gossip. Mina kept her head held high, leaning confidently into Kalar's side. They were halfway across the bustling square when a harsh, entirely unwelcome voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Where the hell have you been?" Mina and Kalar stopped in their tracks, stepping directly into their path, flanked by 2 of his wealthy, sneering friends, was Cedric. He looked perfectly groomed, entirely arrogant, and furiously red in the face. His eyes darted from Mina to her intertwined hand with Kalar, his upper lip curling into an ugly sneer as he aggressively blocked their way home. Chapter 10. The entire village square went completely dead silent. The baker stopped kneading, the blacksmith lowered his hammer, and every set of eyes locked onto the confrontation in the center of the cobblestones. Cedric puffed out his chest, looking down his nose at Mina. He was dressed in pristine velvet, entirely untouched by the harsh realities of the world outside the village boundaries. "I asked you a question, Mina. You vanish into the woods for a week, making everyone think you're dead, and you crawl back into town holding hands with a filthy, wandering mercenary." Cedric sneered, raking a disgusted look over Kalar's mud-caked boots, ripped tunic, and blood-stained bracers. "I suppose you were just desperate for attention. Come here, stop making a fool of yourself in front of my friends." He reached out to grab Mina's wrist. A week ago, Mina would have flinched. A week ago, Kalar would have ripped Cedric's arm off at the shoulder. But now, things were different. Kalar didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth, and he certainly didn't step in front of her to play the overbearing protector. Instead, the ruthless Alpha King simply dropped Mina's hand, took a casual half-step back, and crossed his massive arms over his chest. A wicked, intensely proud smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. His glowing hazel eyes locked onto Mina, fully trusting her to handle her own battles. Mina let out a slow, deliberate breath. She didn't shrink away from Cedric. She stepped directly into his space, channeling every single ounce of the biting, lethal wit she had learned from the king standing behind her. "Don't touch me, Cedric," she stated, her voice carrying a cold, ringing authority that echoed across the quiet square. "And don't speak to me like you own me. You gave up that right the moment you decided to parade your new betrothed around the bonfire, just to make me feel small." Cedric blinked, clearly entirely thrown by her utter lack of submission. "Mina, be reasonable. Look at you. You're covered in dirt. You're acting crazy. I'm trying to help you save face." "Save face?" Mina cut him off, letting out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Cedric, you have the posture of a boiled cabbage and the spine of a jellyfish. You flinch when pigeons fly too close to your head. You are terrified of your own shadow. The only reason you brought her to the bonfire was because you knew I was too strong for you, and your fragile ego couldn't handle it." The crowd gasped collectively. One of Cedric's wealthy friends choked on a laugh, desperately trying to disguise it as a cough. Cedric's face turned a violent shade of magenta. "How dare you? You are nothing. You are a plain, boring village girl who kisses strangers because she's desperate. And you're coming back here with this absolute nobody." "Actually," Mina said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, silky purr that made Kalar's smirk widen into a full, predatory grin. Kissing a stranger was the greatest decision of my life. It taught me what an actual man feels like. For the record, Cedric, you kiss like a suffocating trout. A few villagers openly shrieked with laughter. The tavern keep slapped his knee. Cedric stood frozen in the dirt, his mouth opening and closing like the exact fish Mina had just described. His ego was entirely, publicly, and irreversibly decimated. Mina didn't even wait for a response. She turned her back on him completely, dismissing his entire existence, and stepped up to the towering man waiting for her. Kalar uncrossed his arms, his chest rumbling with a deep, dark chuckle that sent shivers straight down Mina's spine. He stepped forward, wrapping one massive arm around her waist and pulling her flush against him. As entirely entertaining as it is to watch my mate verbally dismantle you, Kalar's voice boomed, projecting effortlessly across the square with the crushing weight of absolute royalty. "I am afraid you are mistaken about my identity, little cabbage," Cedric stammered, taking an involuntary step back as the raw, suffocating aura of Kalar's alpha power finally crashed over the crowd. "I am Kalar," he declared smoothly, "the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, sovereign of the Fae Woods, and the apex predator of this entire continent. And you are standing too close to my queen." The reaction was immediate. The villagers, realizing exactly who had just walked into their town, dropped to their knees in a synchronized wave of terrified reverence. Even Cedric's friends scrambled backward, bowing their heads to the cobblestones. Cedric simply stood there, trembling so violently he looked like he might actually pass out. But Kalar wasn't looking at him anymore. He only had eyes for Mina. Right there, in the center of the quiet, kneeling village, Kalar cupped the back of Mina's neck. His golden eyes flared with a primal, possessive fire. Mina tilted her head back, offering herself to him completely. With a low, feral growl that vibrated through the very stones of the square, the Alpha King leaned down and sank his fangs into the crook of her neck. For the claiming mark sent a blinding rush of pure, golden euphoria straight through their connected minds. It wasn't a magic spell forcing them together anymore. It was a choice, a permanent, beautiful tether forged in the fire of the Fae Woods. Kalar slowly pulled back, soothing the mark with his tongue before pressing a tender, lingering kiss to her forehead. Mina wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest, entirely oblivious to the stunned villagers and her stuttering, humiliated ex. They had survived the ancient magic, the crumbling ruins, and the deep, terrifying vulnerability of their own hearts. Mina tightened her grip on her Alpha King, closing her eyes as a warm, perfect peace settled over her mind. She was never going to be invisible again.
You held the silver in your trembling hand, offering the freedom I had planned. But looking in your eyes of hazel gold,